Welcome everyone to the JCPOA webinar, Returning to Iran Nuclear Talks, Understanding the Current Dilemma. I am Karen Kasner, a JCPOA Executive Committee member, and it is my pleasure to be with you today to discuss this very important and timely issue. JCPOA is the national network hub of the Jewish Community Relations Network, representing 125 local JCRCs as well as 16 national organizations. JCPOA brings together the Jewish community to grapple with pressing issues of the day through a Jewish lens, set priorities, and work in common cause with diverse organizations and coalitions to combat injustice and hate. JCPOA has organized this very important webinar today to ensure that the Jewish community is informed on the substantive nature of the Iran nuclear talks and to hear diverse perspectives on them. We know that this issue can be polarizing, and we are all concerned about Israel's safety and security. Today, we will hear from experts that will discuss what the goals are of the meeting, if it is in the interests of the United States and Israel, and if there is still time to roll back Iran's nuclear ambitions. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm going to give you very short introductions so you have more time for the program. Please refer to the logger bios in your promotional materials sent by email. Michael Singh, who will moderate this panel, is Elaine Swig Senior Fellow and Managing Director at the Washington Institute for Near East Studies and a former Director for the Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. As the Institute's Managing Director, Mr. Singh conducts policy research and participates in public debate over the direction and content of United States Middle East policy. Eric Brewer is Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Project on Nuclear Issues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He specializes in nuclear proliferation, Iran, and North Korea. Elisa Catalano Ewers is an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, focusing on the Middle East and U.S. national security and foreign policy. Behnam Taleblu is a senior fellow at the FDD, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. He has closely tracked a wide range of Iran-related topics, including nuclear non-proliferation, ballistic missiles, sanctions, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, and internal Iranian politics. If you find today's webinar informative, we ask that you join JCPOA's future webinars and consider making a donation to their programming. And they're having their virtual benefit, I have to make a plug, on December 14th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. All this information is on jewishpublicaffairs.org. I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed friend, since I sit on Washington Institute's board as well as JCPOA's board, Michael Singh.
Great, thank you, Karen, and thank you everyone at the JCPOA, and thank you all for tuning in today to join us in this conversation. I have the easy task today of moderating this conversation amongst three really great experts on this issue and on foreign policy, national security policy in general, Elisa and Eric and Behnam. I want to just first try to set the issue up a little bit for everyone, because this Iran nuclear issue is one which, despite having now dragged on for so long, is also an issue which moves and changes very quickly. I think you all know that the Biden administration came in hoping to get back into the 2015 nuclear agreement, the so-called JCPOA. And President Biden talked about using that mutual US and Iranian return to compliance with that agreement as a first step towards getting a stronger agreement. And that notion that we need to get a stronger agreement suggested that we had maybe returned, at least implicitly, to some sort of bipartisan policy consensus on Iran, because of course the Trump administration, in a very different way, also was hoping to get a stronger nuclear agreement with Iran, although of course they did it by way of exiting the JCPOA in 2015. My sense is the Biden administration thought the first step would be easy. The first step of going back to the JCPOA. And I think they suspected the Iranians too would want back into the JCPOA because they would get sanctions relief for an economy that was struggling as a result of President Trump's maximum pressure campaign. But it hasn't proven to be easy. And it's not gotten any easier in the what now 11 months, which have followed President Biden's inauguration. In fact, we have a new administration now in Tehran, which is more hardline than the previous administration, and has been, in fact, fiercely critical of the JCPOA and those who negotiated it on behalf of Iran, and which is likely to come to the nuclear talks, which now are finally set to resume on November 29th in Vienna, with an even more obstinate position. And I'll leave it to our panelists to talk about what that position might in fact be. Which means that maybe we won't get a return to the JCPOA. And because all of this is taking place against the backdrop of Iran rapidly expanding its nuclear program, going to now not 19.75% enrichment, which is where they had stopped for some time, but 60% enrichment, most of the way towards the 90% enrichment that they would need for a nuclear weapon. They've also curtailed to a significant extent their cooperation with nuclear inspectors, which means that not only are we concerned about what Iran is doing, we're worried we're not even sure that we have the full picture of what Iran is doing. All of this leads to some pretty grim scenarios if the Biden administration can't successfully, as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says, put this issue back in the box. So that's the context for where we are now. And that's what our panelists are going to discuss. What happens now? Where should we go? Where is it likely to go? And so forth. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Elisa.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to JCPOA for the invitation and for my colleagues on the panel and for all of you for this discussion. I'm going to try and pick up where Mike started us in terms of kind of the state of play where we are today. I'm going to try to do it somewhat dispassionately and cover a lot of ground in a really short amount of time. But Mike set us up already for parts of this. So let me build on some of that. Starting with the Biden administration coming into office, these talks to return to mutual compliance with the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, resumed in April, which was a bit later than some might have imagined, given the express views of the Biden campaign before January 20th. And we can talk about maybe our collective views on that later on in the Q&A. But what I would note is that between April and June, those negotiations were incredibly intense. And they happened despite some hiccups along the way, notably explosions that happened at some of Iran's nuclear facilities, lots of rhetoric back and forth publicly, et cetera. And I think the general consensus is that those talks managed to make some progress, clearly not enough progress, but then a number of difficult issues remained kind of a bridge too far before Iran's presidential election in June when talks ceased. And we waited for a new Iranian administration to take over at the end of the summer and presumably resume. Of course, that's not what happened. And of course, the Iran nuclear program had no such pause, as Mike indicated. And I'm going to go through a couple of those steps. Some of my colleagues are best positioned to talk about what these mean at a technical level, but I think it's important to kind of picture some of the things that have happened in the Iranian nuclear program certainly since June. As Mike mentioned, an increase in the way in which Iran enriches its uranium, both in terms of the level, the 60% that Mike mentioned, but also in the volume of the stockpile that Iran has produced and maintained. Another important element of its progress involves what we nerds who talk about Iran all day call the uranium metal, enriched uranium metal piece, which is a troubling development given the application of uranium metal. And again, some of my colleagues, and I'm looking at you, Eric, can talk a little bit more about what this may or may not mean moving forward. Iran also, a couple of other things, installed and employed much more advanced centrifuges, which means that they can enrich uranium more efficiently than they did before. And probably most troubling is that they blocked access to the monitoring that is enshrined in the JCPOA and that is conducted by the UN International Atomic Energy Agency. And that's what all of us rely on to have as best a picture of the Iranian nuclear program as we can at any given point. Now, I'll note some of these steps have remedy. Centrifuges can be uninstalled, uranium can be shipped out. But I think the key point here for all of us to keep in mind as we talk about what happens next is that the experience and knowledge that Iran has gained from proceeding on these elements in their program really strengthens the indigenous nature of the program and cannot be reversed as easily. I think Iran has taken some steps on this. In September, just a few months ago, it agreed to reinstate some of the monitoring at its nuclear facilities, but it held out full access to some of that material until the US is in full compliance with the JCPOA again. So not the full picture and not the full compliance that we would all hope for. The Director General of the IAEA is set to be in Iran just in a few days on Monday. And so we'll see how that kind of leads into negotiations resuming on November 29th. They, of course, are set to resume in Vienna after now 5 months of a gap. I think there are a couple of things to note about the context around this. One, on the Iranian side, we've seen a number of markers that have been set publicly. The new chief negotiator for Iran, Ali Bagheri Khani, has spent most of last week engaging in European capitals. He, as well as other members of the Iranian administration, have repeated a number of demands publicly. The two most significant, I think, for our conversation on where the talks go from here is, one, the demand to lift all sanctions. This is not a new demand, but it does continue to include not only nuclear-related sanctions that the US and its allies have in place, but also sanctions related to Iran's terrorism activity, its human rights violations, and other non-nuclear areas. And the second is this guarantee that the United States not be allowed or not have an easy way to leave the JCPOA, to abandon the deal, should a new president come into office. And this has a lot to do with how the Trump administration withdrew from the deal in 2018 to begin with. I'll add here just kind of editorially that this is not unusual for Iran to make these kinds of demands and to make such terms publicly before negotiations. It's something we saw certainly earlier this year, but we've seen repeatedly over the course of negotiations over the last 15 years. They aren't hard and fast rules, but they do set a marker to which every stakeholder has to respond in one form or choose not to respond. I think 2 or 3 other key points I want to raise about context, and then I want to talk a little bit about the region for a minute or two. Where the United States and its allies are on this, I think the most obvious statement of that position is in the lead up to and the statements at the G20 summit just earlier this month, where they said very clearly that they are convinced that it is still possible to bring everyone back into compliance with the nuclear deal, but also sent some very clear signals that Iran is testing the collective patience here, and that time was not infinite with respect to when negotiations should resume and when ultimately agreement on compliance should be achieved. Iran was, in the meantime, admitted in September as a full member of what's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I mention this because of who the other members of the SCO are, namely Russia, China, but also India, Pakistan, and other states in Central Asia. And given the last 24, 48 hours where Iran and Russia have had conversations about the nuclear deal in particular, China has come out with a statement with respect to the nuclear deal, essentially stating that all three are in agreement with what should happen next in nuclear negotiations, which signals kind of entrenched positions, with the US the EU representative, UK, Germany, and France on one side of the negotiations, Russia, China, and Iran on the other. Let's talk about the Middle East for a minute or two. I think here you have some really interesting developments, some of which are in tension with one another. First, over the course of the last year or plus, we've seen some direct talks between Iran and Arab governments in the region. The most notable of this being between Saudi Arabia and Iran that have been facilitated by the Iraqis in Baghdad, a series of conversations that have stopped and started and stopped and started again, but a channel that clearly has opened, however tenuous it might be. The United Arab Emirates, the same, with senior officials just in the last few days reiterating their commitment to de-escalation, and a recognition, I think, by all of us who follow this issue that there are certainly channels between security officials in Arab governments and Iran, certainly with the focus of trying to avoid miscalculation and de-escalate, at least on discrete issues, if not more strategic issues. At the same time, we've seen continued provocation by Iran in the region. Again, a whole series of things here, but I'll just mention one or two most recent, the attack on US troops in Syria that was attributed to an Iranian drone attack, a recent slew of cyber attacks against US infrastructure, as well as partner infrastructure that's speculated to have come out of Iran, and continued US and Israeli targeting inside of Syria of Iran provided weapon caches, militants, other material that's moving in and out of Syria by Iranians proxies with Iran's aid. Some low-level provocations at sea against between Iranian vessels and US military vessels. So no shortage of provocations, even at a low level, that have continued through this period. I think one of the other things I would note here that we can talk about in the Q&A a little bit more is an indication of just where the US and its partners in the region continue to go with respect to addressing the threats that emanate from Iran and Iran's Iranian foreign policy. And one of the indications of this is something that we just saw in the last couple of days, which was the first ever joint naval exercise that included the United States, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, and Bahrain in the region. So continued US commitment to its partners in the region through military means, not abating even during this period of resuming negotiations. I haven't touched upon the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which we certainly can talk about, but let me just leave you with a couple of things of what do I think all this means. One, the resumption of negotiations will be challenged, right? The substance of what compliance for compliance means, the entrenched positions from the different sides of the negotiation, each having their own leverage and different cards to play. It's not impossible, but I have restrained enthusiasm that we're going to find some immediate breakthrough, announced on November 30th. The second is that we have this simultaneously low simmering tensions, but with an efforts to keep a lid on it for the most part. I think this is indicative of actors in the region in particular being nervous about the resumption of the deal. And of course, we'll have time to talk about this a little bit with respect to Israel in particular in the Q&A. But I think also worried about what happens if there is nothing that as Mike quoted Jake Sullivan, puts the Iranian nuclear program back in a box. And the changing nature of these interactions that have started since Trump withdrew from the deal, but that has been going on since. So there's a lot of hedging from all sides. And then my final point, I think that hopefully will lead well into what my colleagues will say next, is that time is not infinite. At some point there will be a calculation that the benefits of returning to compliance in the deal are diminishing. I don't assess that moment has arrived, but the debate about when that tipping point actually will be is only going to increase from here.
Great, thank you, Elisa. Before I turn over to Eric, let me just point out one thing, which is we have a Q&A chat. If you have questions, please type your questions in that box, because that's how we will get questions for the Q&A. So you can go ahead and do that throughout the presentations, either questions that you have that aren't answered in the presentations, or if you need clarification. Obviously, we're using a lot of technical terms, discussing a lot of complicated subjects. If you need anything clarified, please feel free to put your question in the Q&A. I'll try during the Q&A to take the questions in the order they come in. I may group them if there are similar themes. So please go ahead and do that while our panelists are speaking. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Eric Brewer.
Thanks, Mike. Real pleasure to be with all of you today, and appreciate the invitation to join you. Maybe I'll sort of talk a little bit in a little bit more detail about some of the technical things that Iran is doing, because I think it's important. You know, we hear about this in the news. We always hear headlines about Iranian enrichment and all this sort of things, but I think it's worth talking about, you know, what exactly is Iran doing that's a problem, and why is it a problem, right? And so you heard both Mike and Elisa talk about Iran's enrichment program, right? And you know, this is, you know, you've probably seen pictures of all the centrifuges in a row. And, you know, what essentially Iran's doing is it's feeding a gas into those things, it's spinning it around, and it's purifying that gas, right? That's the enrichment process. Now, this material, when it's at low levels of enrichment, you know, 5%-ish, it can be used as fuel for nuclear reactors. That's, you know, a so-called peaceful purpose. But of course, when it's enriched to higher levels, you know, such as 90%, that's when it's used for a bomb. And as both Mike and Elisa said, Iran is now producing enriched uranium at both 20% and 60% levels. It sounds like, you know, it's not exactly a translation of like, you know, 60% is 60% of the way there to 90 or to 100. But it's actually much further along than that. The work that Iran has to do to get it to that 90% level for a bomb is actually much less. It's a much shorter step. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So that's the first thing that Iran has ramped up recently that's highly problematic. The other thing is Iran's work with advanced centrifuges, right? For years, Iran had this first generation of centrifuge that it adapted from the Pakistani model that it purchased. And it, you know, it's fine, you know, but it's really not that good. And so what Iran's really focused on over time, particularly since the US left the deal and Iran's ramped up its activities, is developing, building, installing, and really practicing using these more advanced machines that are far more efficient and more powerful than Iran's older models. And what these allow Iran to do is produce material, or they would allow Iran to produce material for a weapon much faster if it decided to break out. And you probably hear that term a lot, you know, nuclear breakout. And of course, on cue go my lights in my office. So hold on one second here so you can see me. You know, you probably hear about breakout a lot. Really what that's referencing is a decision by Iran to use those enrichment facilities to go for it, right? To go all out and dash for that nuclear weapon, produce that material for a device. And it's also important to note that that is not an actively ticking clock. Like you may read in the papers that Iran's breakout timeline is now 2 months or 3 months. That's from a decision to break out, right? It's not like 2 months from now Iran's going to have a weapon. It's from a decision, which so far there's been no evidence that Iran has made, and we probably see that happen. I'll talk about that again in just a second. So as Iran's, you know, it's using these machines, it's gaining a lot of really important experience using them that it didn't have before, that it didn't have prior to the deal. And so, you know, while you can ship out highly enriched uranium, you can pull centrifuges out of the ground, what you can't do is wipe away that experience that Iran's gained from operating these machines. And that's really problematic when it comes to potentially going back into the deal for the United States. When you hear the US talk about the non-proliferation benefits of the deal being reduced, that's one of the big things that it's talking about. So there's big questions about whether or not that year-long breakout timeline that was part of the deal could even really be restored. Now, again, you hear a lot about breakout, but actually I'm not quite sure that's the biggest concern. And one of the reasons for that is that breakout is really going to happen at a place where the IAEA, these are the international inspectors that go in and monitor Iran's nuclear program, that they're already watching, right? They go there on a fairly regular basis so they can see what Iran is doing. And so, you know, there's a good chance that if Iran tried to do that, the inspectors would know, right? Because it's a very obvious thing. The one risk there, and this is what a lot of us are concerned about, right? As Iran's timeline shrinks, that margin for error gets a lot smaller. And the window for international action to stop Iran from breaking out, if they were to catch Iran doing it, gets a lot smaller. And that's why politicians want these longer breakout timelines. The third sort of category of things that Iran is doing that's really problematic, that we're concerned about, is the access that it's providing to international inspectors. Right now, Iran's really at the kind of the bare minimum level of access that it's required to provide the IAEA. It took all of the extra things that it did under the JCPOA and basically has stopped doing them. And so that's a problem, because one of the things Iran's doing right now that the IAEA doesn't actively see and have eyes on is producing parts for some of these new centrifuges. You know, it's doing them at the facility that the IAEA doesn't have cameras at, isn't allowed to visit. And why that's a problem is because, and why you want access to that facility, is to make sure that Iran's not making those parts and then sort of taking them and sneaking them out a back door to a covert enrichment facility. And so that's why the JCPOA put in place those types of monitoring mechanisms to make sure that Iran wasn't going to divert these components for a covert enrichment facility. And so not having eyes on that right now is a problem. There's no evidence Iran's doing that. And in fact, there's some good reasons to believe it's probably not, but it is a growing concern and a growing problem. I do want to take a quick second to talk about, you know, all these really bad things are happening. Iran's program is in many ways more advanced than it has been ever before. But, you know, let's talk about how we got here for just a quick second, right? All of these things that I mentioned would almost certainly not be happening right now had the United States stayed in the JCPOA and not withdrawn in mid-2018, right? Because it was at that point when that happened, Iran actually waited for a year before doing anything, but after that year, that's when it started this nuclear ramp up, right? Under the JCPOA, Iran's not allowed to enrich to 60%. It's not allowed to enrich to 20%. It's only allowed to enrich to 3.67%, which is much lower. It poses very, very little risk of going to nuclear weapons. It was restricted in the types of advanced centrifuges that it could produce and test. It would not be allowed to do anything close to the level that it's doing today. And those restrictions were put in place specifically so Iran's program would only grow gradually and over time. And of course, as I mentioned before, the IAEA would be allowed to monitor Iran producing those components, those widgets for these centrifuges. The IAEA was allowed to have continuous monitoring. So not only could it physically go to these production facilities, but it had cameras that were in operation 24/7 that could prevent Iran, or at least make it easily noticeable if Iran were to take some of those and try and sneak those away to a covert facility. It is absolutely true. You'll hear people who don't like the JCPOA talk about how these restrictions would have eventually come off. That is certainly true for a lot of these. But my argument has always been, at least you have some degree of predictability then, and you have time in some cases, many, many years to figure out what we're going to do about that problem. It was much more predictable than where we are today, where we don't have any of those tools and any of those constraints in place. So once Trump left the deal in 2018 and Iran began to ramp up sanctions, Iran responded, of course, by ramping up its nuclear program. That time period under the Trump administration and heading into the Biden administration helped convince many of those within Iran, the supreme leader, many of the more hardline elements of the regime that were skeptical of the JCPOA to begin with. Remember, not everybody in Iran liked the deal. So those that were skeptical, this convinced them that in fact the JCPOA was a bad idea, right? It confirmed their fears, their worst fears, that the US could never be trusted, that the benefits, the economic benefits they expected to come were never going to arrive. And now these are the people that are in power in Iran, right? This is the new Raisi presidential administration. And they want a better deal than the JCPOA, right? And we've already talked about some of the demands they're making that go well beyond the scope of the JCPOA and are things that the United States could never even provide, like, you know, legal guarantees that a future president wouldn't withdraw. this same group also happens to believe that the only way they can secure that better deal is by digging in, by resisting, by building up the nuclear program and increasing their leverage at the negotiating table. And as I mentioned, in doing so, they've taken away a lot of the non-proliferation benefits that the United States had under that deal. And so now it's, as Elisa alluded to, we're really at the point now where, it's kind of decision time about whether or not this deal really is in the United States interest, if we could even get back to it, if that's even possible. So we find ourselves in this very unfortunate position heading into talks at the end of this month. And I'm sure many of those on here are quite pessimistic about whether those talks are going to produce any progress or any real fruit. And so, that leaves the United States with a couple of choices, right? If you can't get back to the JCPOA, then what do? There's, of course, the option for that longer, stronger, bigger, better deal that was referenced earlier. That would put bigger restrictions, bigger limitations on Iran's nuclear program and perhaps its missile program or other areas in exchange for much more expansive sanctions relief, right? This is kind of what Mike talked about at the beginning. This is the thing that actually is probably the only Iran issue that both sides of the aisle agree on, right? At this point is like, that's the desirable deal. And Iran's demands kind of open up the opportunity to talk about some of that stuff because they want things that are far beyond the JCPOA. The problem with that is, it's unclear if Iran's going to be willing to give any more on the nuclear program on that front. And negotiating that deal is going to take a really long time. And given the pace of Iran's nuclear program right now, US does not have that time. So the alternative to that would potentially be kind of this, smaller interim deal, short of the JCPOA that would require that Iran limit perhaps the most worrisome aspects of its program right now, like maybe the 60% enrichment, maybe pause the installation of some of those more advanced centrifuges in exchange for far less sanctions relief. And that way you're kind of buying time, building in space, preventing escalation, so you can have time to negotiate the deal that both sides perhaps actually want and would find longer lasting and beneficial. The problem with that, though, is Iran has also rejected that offer right now. So, or it has in the past. So, that really remains to be seen whether that's something that Iran's going to agree to. So all of this to say we're in a very, very difficult position. The chances for succeeding and getting back to the JCPOA, I think, are basically slim to none at this point. And so on that happy note, perhaps I'll leave it there and turn it back to Mike.
Great, thank you, Eric. That's it's very helpful. I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of follow-up questions about those topics. I'm going to turn things over now to Behnam. Go ahead, Behnam.
Thank you so much, Mike, and to all my virtual colleagues for sharing the Zoom stage with me, and of course JCPOA for organizing, I think, what is a very, very timely event ahead of not just the talks on the 29th to potentially resurrect the JCPOA in Vienna, or as Eric just said, perhaps an interim deal, but ahead of other things such as the IAEA Board of Governors meeting. I think it's certainly no accident, of course, that the Islamic Republic put its decision to resume negotiations with Western powers with the P5+1 after the Board of Governors meeting. They want to actually tie their negotiating posture to if they're going to be censured again for many of those violations or many of those impediments that both of the panelists so eloquently talked about, Iran kind of incrementally ramping up. And the point of that incremental wrapping up is what I want to talk to you about today, but particularly from the Iranian perspective, because we can debate this from both sides of the aisle or without any side of the aisle from the Washington perspective all day. But there's a good line former Secretary Mattis used to say, and I think he used to say it often, and it's kind of apocryphal because it's quoted quite differently, but it's the adversary gets a vote, or your enemy gets to have a vote. And in this sense, Iran does get to have a vote, and its behavior and its rhetoric is telling you very much how it's voting. Now, there are many, many, many differences that I'm going to hope to unpack for you guys today between the Rouhani and Raisi administrations, the negotiating styles, and the constellation of characters. But there is kind of one overarching macro continuity to keep in mind. Iran had a three-part response by virtue of its behavior to that event that Eric had just mentioned, which is the Trump administration leaving the JCPOA on May 8th, 2018. And that was, phase one was, strategic patience, that like many here in Washington and like many in Europe, if you talk to them, and like many in Asia, if you talk to them, the Rouhani administration then, plus Foreign Minister Zarif and that cast of characters, they did not believe that unilaterally Washington could replicate the macroeconomic pain that took almost a decade to multilaterally build up and implement and enforce. They did not believe that that was possible. But literally about a year later, on May 8th, 2019, the macroeconomics spoke for themselves. A couple more unilateral US sanctions enforcement measures, the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation of the IRGC, and several other US moves to continue Iran under what was called basically the maximum pressure campaign or the maximum pressure policy. Rouhani announced what was just spoken about, which is the kind of the incremental unwinding of Iran's adherence to the JCPOA. So this was no longer about Iranian private violations of the spirit of the deal, or no longer about Iranian public violations of Annex B of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 that enshrined and codified the JCPOA. This was Iran's decision to be very public about incrementally unwinding its adherence to the deal. And it began quite slowly. So phase 2 from 2019 to about mid-2020-ish, mid to late 2020, you can call this graduated escalation, where in the region, Iran began to ramp up significantly its support for the militias. You know, famously, May 2019 is when those spate of rocket, drone, and ultimately mortar attacks against facilities associated with the US force presence in Iraq began. More escalation in the naval domain, more escalation in the maritime domain, more missile transfers, things of this nature. But ultimately, on the nuclear file, there was a very slow unwinding of the JCPOA, and Iran couched these moves as being reversible, designed to gradually drip every 90, every 180 days, a new violation onto the books designed to kind of force then the Trump administration to abandon its pressure policy, unwind those unilateral sanctions, and return to the JCPOA. You know, starting mid to late 2020, but really into 2021, you can call this significant escalation. So the regime has decided to really ramp up this pressure policy. It's maintaining some of the moves it's been doing in the region, particularly when it comes to the production, procurement, and proliferation of drones, which is really the latest star of the whole spectrum of unmanned aerial threats that Tehran has mastered. You know, Elisa talked about the drone attack in southeastern Syria against a position there also affiliated with the US force presence. There was a drone attack by a Shia militia linked to Tehran that had tried to literally assassinate the Iraqi prime minister just a few weeks ago. So there's a greater sense of emboldenment there. But in terms of the nuclear violations, it's precisely what Elisa and Eric mentioned, that these are actually irreversible in a sense, that they're really teaching something new to the Iranians, that even if they cease the activity pursuant to a political agreement, there is no longer a technical impediment to them engaging in this kind of activity. The 60% threat, you know, we're all older Iran watchers here. This is a threat the regime made in 2011, 2012. You know, they were dangling the fig leaf of potential nuclear propulsion for nuclear submarines that they don't even have. At best, they have Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines that they bought from Russia in the early to mid-1990s. So they don't even have the kind of propulsion, but they wanted to develop this kind of technology then. And so this was a threat in the face of multilateral sanctions in 2011, 2012. And the regime finally felt comfortable or emboldened enough to act on this threat in 2021, specifically April 2021. And that brings us to you know, this repetition of history. I want to kind of stress for everyone is not an accident. It's in fact a product of the domestic politics in Tehran. There's really a deja vu moment going on, and it's kind of a 2004, 5, and 6 all over again. In 2004, you had an ultra hardline parliament come in on the last year of the reformist presidency of Mohammad Khatami. In 2005, you had a very contested presidential election, which went to a second round that ushered in you know, former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And in 2006, you had the escalation and intensification and the politicization of the Iranian nuclear issue, and the moving of the file previously from the IAEA Board of Governors to the UN Security Council, Chapter 7 sanctions against the Islamic Republic, multiple UN Security Council resolutions against Iran, and 2006 to really 2015 being almost a decade of multilateral pressure against the Islamic Republic, and something Tehran felt comfortable then absorbing and escalating. And, you know, Iranians always talk about, the regime officials in Tehran always talk about under this period of sanctions, how they were able to go from 500 centrifuges to almost 19,000. And that was just of the type that Eric was mentioning, the IR-1. So in this sense, I see where we're headed with the new constellation and the new domestic balance in Tehran as a repetition of 2004, 5, 6. In February 2020, for instance, you had, again, parliamentary elections or selections, the lowest ever turnout for that parliamentary election, and an ultra hardline parliament dominating. In 2021, you had also record low turnout for this presidential election, the lowest ever since 1979. And then you had Ebrahim Raisi selected / rather than elected as the new head of the presidency of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I fear that 2022 will, in a sense, mirror the kind of Iranian comfortability with escalation that we saw starting in 2006, once there was beginning multilateral pressure against the Islamic Republic. And one reason, of course, is this lack of trust that Eric mentioned, but the lack of trust is, in a sense, nonpartisan inside the Islamic Republic. Whenever people talk about, that the new Constellation of Power doesn't necessarily trust America, that's true. They don't, but they're more comfortable with escalation, hence they're more dangerous. But even people like Foreign Minister Zarif, when he used to come to New York, I think it was a CFR event or an Asia Society event in the period that the JCPOA was in force, he was talking about the JCPOA was not based on trust, that the regime still did not trust America. So trust was not necessarily a causal factor in getting Tehran to come to the table or agree to the JCPOA, even backed by the Iranian architects of the JCPOA. This is their words, not mine. But rather than take the approach that the Rouhani and Zarifs of the world took, this new Constellation of Power feels comfortable escalating. And if they feel comfortable absorbing the pressure, and they feel comfortable that there will be no replication of pressure. This is something that, Khamenei feels particularly. He's the supreme leader of the country. That's a title meant to be taken rather literally inside the Islamic Republic. He's in the 8th decade of his life and the 3rd decade of his career as supreme leader. He's in no mood to change. She's shown no signs to change, not about his foreign policy, not about his domestic policy, and certainly not the nuclear policy. There's graduations, there's ups and downs, but ultimately Khamenei is a man in the search of a legacy. And this nuclear program, which was resurrected amid the Iran-Iraq war, was no science fair project. It was the regime on the quest for the ultimate deterrent, much like things the regime also professes not to ever want to negotiate about. Ballistic missiles, also developed during the Iran-Iraq war, also trying to provide the regime with some sense of deterrence so it can continue its foreign and security policy in a more unencumbered fashion. So the Raisi cabinet, they're comfortable with this kind of escalation. They're ultimately going to be tools that Khamenei has to get this ultimate deterrent in whatever form you want to think it may take. And this brings me to an inflection point or a question in what is the ultimate purpose of this nuclear escalation? Is it really simply to develop these capabilities and trade it away for sanctions relief, whether it be for an interim deal that they've publicly rejected and may want to agree to in 2022? Or is it to practice for something worse? Is it to practice for something like Breakout? Is it to practice to develop some kind of other capabilities? Is it to gradually not just turn the screws on the international community and when it comes to worrying about Iran's escalation in declared sites, but potentially raise the specter of undeclared sites, raise the specter of not knowing what is going on in previously declared sites, something that Eric had previously mentioned, when they are doing more gross things like limiting IAEA access, not just to sites, not just to scientists, but to the IAEA's own surveillance equipment and the IAEA's own surveillance videos. So they're finding ways to creatively turn the screws. And so we have to always ask about the intention of the actor here. And this is something that I think that reading in this new ultra hardline balance, reading in Khamenei into this equation, and reading in the broader history of the nuclear program. Yes, the nuclear program went public in a sense in 2002 when undeclared sites were revealed, but the program did not begin in 2002. And in fact, what we know from the Atomic Archive, the Israelis seized and unveiled, and later on even IAEA reporting, that this was a crash program, that there actually was a weapons dimension. And perhaps as Khamenei moves forward, both in his career and with the nuclear program, he may feel that Washington really doesn't have a plan B. And with this new constellation of ultra hardliners at the helm, they are more comfortable with their plan B. They may not think that something like maximum pressure, be it unilateral or multilateral, will be coming back anytime soon. For those of you who've been watching the news in the lead up to these negotiations, they matter so much because it's the first time the Raisi administration is going to be engaging with the P5+1. But ultimately, if you look at what Washington has been saying when the Raisi administration has been in, there's been a whole slew of metaphors of closing doors and narrowing runways and diminishing windows and diminishing tarmacs. But ultimately, they're still trying to hold the door open. And this says that there may not necessarily be that plan B in Washington. There may not necessarily be that stomach to engage in another bout of sanctions versus centrifuges. And I think at this late stage in the game, if there is a no after November 29th, or if talks do progress, in 2022, we have to always keep in mind this Iranian intentionality and what this new constellation of actors at the lower level, plus the more stodgy, rigid preferences of people like Khamenei, what they really want out of this. What is the purpose of this program? What are they willing to trade away for a political impediment or a technical impediment? And I think that's something to read into the conversation as to how does the adversary both act and react. They are responding to our pressure, but also they are agents in their own sense.
Great, thank you, Behnam. Thanks for three really, I think, excellent presentations, which raised really a ton of issues. And unfortunately, we don't have time to get to all of those issues. So we could sit here for 3 hours, I think, talking about them. So there have been a lot of questions in the Q&A box. Some of those have already been answered by our panelists. So make sure if you're following along and you have your computer, you look at the answered questions, you might find some things you've been wondering about answered. But I'm going to try to sort of synthesize some of the questions and pose them to our panelists. We're going to try to give you guys brief answers so that we can get to as many questions as possible. So I think there was a sort of, I think, a hint of pessimism from everybody. And I think that reflects the international mood about what is likely to come from the talks that resume on November 29th. You know, we talked about the fact that the Iranians maybe are more skeptical of the value of sanctions relief. We talked about the new hardline administration in Iran, which was fiercely critical of the JCPOA prior to taking power. And so that leads naturally, I think, to this question of Plan B. And so I'm interested in whichever of you, and it could be all of you, your thoughts on if, in fact, the Biden administration cannot achieve this goal of a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA by the US and Iran, what then from the United States and our partners, and what then from Iran? What does that world look like? So whoever wants to answer that, go ahead.
I'll take a stab at it, Mike. So I think, you know, if the United States makes this decision that, you know, revival of the JCPOA either is impossible or really no longer in our interests, you know, I think the logical place that it will turn is, you know, an effort to increase economic and diplomatic pressure on Iran, with the hopes of convincing the Iranians to come back to the table and, you know, make a serious effort to negotiate. The challenge with that path is that Iran's going to be able to add centrifuges faster than the United States can add sanctions designations, right? The sanctions designation, the sanctions piece of this and the diplomatic pressure piece of this, there's things you can do quickly, there's things that may take longer, but you need time for that pressure to build and to have an impact on Iran, to have an impact on Iran's economy, and then to have an impact on the thinking of Iran's leaders, which, as we've all sort of talked about, are a different, at least at the presidential administration level, a different set than were in power under Rouhani. And so how the challenge for the United States is, as it pursues that strategy, how does it keep Iran's nuclear program from progressing further, right? It's at a really dangerous place right now. How do you prevent Iran from just outfitting, you know, IR-6s across all, you know, like all of its nuclear facilities? How do you prevent Iran from going higher than 60%? How do you prevent Iran from further reducing inspections, right? Those, I think, are the real challenges. And so I think the United States is going to have to think really hard about, you know, what its actual red lines are in this process, have a real serious set of discussions internally with US allies and partners about what things are sort of deal breakers, so to speak, with the Iranians, and to, I think, really dedicate a lot of resources to keeping eyes on Iran's program and making sure that those things don't happen. And being very clear with the Iranians about what these, you know, I think there's a very good debate to be had over, and areas for legitimate disagreement over, you know, how specific you want to be in red lines, you know, how you want to communicate them. But I think, you know, it's going to have to be very direct with the Iranians about what that message is. And so I think that's going to be the challenge for the United States as if and when it decides to pivot to that part. I think the other challenge the United States will face, I think it will be easier for this administration in some ways because of the way they've gone about it, is keeping allies on its side. And there were some answers to a question that was in the chat that were along these lines about why is the United States continuing to do this if it doesn't think it's going to save the deal. I think part of that strategy is to show the international community, including its allies and including Russia and China to some degree, that like, look, hey, we came back and we were serious about getting back into JCPOA. We bent over backwards to come to an agreement with the Iranians, and we're willing basically to discuss a variety of alternatives, and the Iranians don't want to do it, right? We're showing up, we're here, we're hanging out in the hotel by ourselves, waiting for the Iranians to come talk with us, and they're not coming. And so I think that is part of the strategy, right? And so it makes it a lot easier for the United States to paint Iran as the problematic actor, as the barrier, which, because in reality it is, as it pivots to that strategy and brings allies along with it, which I think is a really critical component. Russia and China, slightly different story, right? I mean, there's only so much convincing you're going to be able to do with them, right? And so, you know, you're not going to expect them to get on board with some type of you know, maximum pressure renewal. You know, that's going to be a constant challenge, and there's a lot of different ways to manage that. But I guess that's my answer to that question, right? I think it's going to end up going back to pressure. The challenge is making that pivot and sort of surviving that period and giving time for pressure to take effect.
Elisa or Behnam, any thoughts on Plan B?
I have a footnote, but Elisa, go first.
Yeah, so do I. So very, very briefly on this question of, and you know, and it's one that I think many of us have already started debating, and all of you who are with us today have probably watched to some extent, is whether pressure can work this far into the game. And I would just pick up on the point that Eric just made about U.S. not being isolated in having to resume that step. What the Trump administration's decisions to withdraw from the deal and to assert the maximum pressure, quote unquote, campaign taught us, even those of us who were firmly against the idea of withdrawing from the deal, and there are at least a number of us on this screen who believe that and still believe that, is that there was still room for pressure, right? The pressure under which the Iranian economy has been, partly due to U.S. and partner pressure, also, you know, largely due to Iranians' own mismanagement of their economy, is not insignificant in the context of the global economic downturn, the post-COVID recovery period. You know, I think it's still debatable at what point the Iranian economy is at a breaking point that suggests to the Iranian regime that it's time to at least talk a little bit more seriously about negotiations, not what the ultimate outcome would be, but certainly to engage more in good faith. And so I think there is some run room there with respect to what pressure might look like on the economic front. I don't know that we should discount that out of hand. But the more important point, I think, is the diplomatic pressure. And you know, here, Russia and China are different. The U.S. is gonna have to make some choices about what it's willing to do or not do with respect to increasing pressure that ultimately is about Chinese interests in Iranian crude oil predominantly, but how it will also engage Moscow with respect to some shared concerns about proliferation, generally speaking, and where the Iranian nuclear program kind of falls on that spectrum. So this might be coming from someone who has sat in that hotel room waiting for the Iranians to show up, going on a decade ago now. But I'm not sure we've played all our cards quite yet.
Behnam?
Yeah, indeed. Just on the sanctions note, you know, this is something Washington has taught, not really it's just itself, but the world quite well. There's always something left to sanction. There's always more pressure. There's always more time to add these kind of things to the docket. I have a laundry list of things that I would like to see in a Plan B. You know, they have like a price floor component. I think something that we would all agree to on this price floor component is the need for diplomatic pressure on the Islamic Republic. The U.S. has proven in spades, the macroeconomics of Iran tell you this quite clearly. In inflation, value of rial relative to the dollar, even oil exports, of the success of the U.S. unilaterally. But diplomatic pressure, you know, real censure at the Board of Governors, potential forwarding back to the Security Council, potential triggering of snapback, And I know this may seem like a rush to a crisis, but in reality, it's not, because if Iran is choosing to escalate, choosing to meet and raise the dial at every single juncture, again, to situate the nuclear program within the larger aims of what this regime is doing and what it wants and how it wants to be governed and how it ultimately wants to impact the region and what it thinks it needs as a de minimis for its own security, it would force Washington, at least on the plus side, to have an Iran policy rather than just a non-proliferation policy or an arms control policy that kicks the can down the road in 5 or 10 or 15-year iterations. So that would be the plus side of this. But a de minimis would be actually having to have a diplomatic option. Now there may be diminishing returns to having the EU on the US side when it comes to sanctions. There would be significant advantages if you have enforcement of the existing penalties when it comes to actors like China that Elisa just mentioned. But on the EU side, I'm a little bit more skeptical of what the impact of them joining us economically would do. But diplomatically, that is really the meaty zone where the Biden administration can escalate in 2022. And there really is a precedent for each step that they can and should take.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I apologize to everyone whose questions we have not been able to answer. But I want to just pick up on one theme, and there's probably only time for one person to answer it and answer it briefly. And that's this question of red lines, which Eric raised. You know, we talk about pressure through sanctions, but we also have talked about Iran's rapidly expanding nuclear program and how that might outpace the effects of sanctions pressure. So then obviously one question that comes into play is the possibility of a military strike, either an American military strike or an Israeli military strike. Policymakers in Washington often worry about the consequences of that kind of strike, getting drawn into another conflict in the Middle East, the potential for Iranian retaliation against Israel, for example, not wanting Israel to be left alone, obviously, to deal with that. So that all points to the need to, if we really are serious about potentially using such a strike, how do we message that? How do we convey that to the Iranians? What do we do to enhance the credibility of any the military threat, either U.S. or Israeli? So does anyone want to try to take that on in the span of 1 or 2 minutes? What can we do to make our military threats more credible?
I can try to intonate a few things, and I'll be super brief. Maybe someone else can also provide a few footnotes, but there's certainly a few lessons we can take from the Israeli playbook here about the way the Israelis have been pushing back on Iran's proxies in the region. Again, situating the nuclear program within the larger threat posed by the Islamic Republic. There's no reason to have to see the Iran nuclear problem as something to be resolved by diplomacy only or something to be resolved by dropping MOABs only. There is this huge gray space in between, and I use that word intentionally because Washington does need to be a better actor in the gray zone, maybe a lower threshold for the use of force against proxies in places like Iraq and Syria, perhaps more multinational interceptions of Iranian weapons proliferation, perhaps more pressure at the Security Council for Iranian drones and light arms proliferation, even to new jurisdictions such as Ethiopia, as we see in headlines now about Iranian drones. There are a whole series of things that we can signal our seriousness about a desire to push back on Iran, and then ultimately have them draw a positive inference about our resolve from one theater onto another before having to come up with any kind of military schematics.
Great. Elisa or Eric, anything to add on that front?
I just reiterate there is the point that I said early on that I think it may get buried in all of this, that the U.S. with partners in the region constellation with respect to deterrence has also changed, and how that will continue to play a role in not only U.S. and Israel or U.S. and Gulf Arab states, but combinations and constellations of that group, I think, are a new kind of addition to this soup that Behnam has laid out, and I think to great effect might be more useful in the coming months as we look at what happens next.
Great, thank you, Elisa. So I think we've hit our end point here. We've run out of time. There's a million more questions we could answer. This is a complicated topic. I would definitely encourage you, all three of these panelists, Elisa, Behnam, and Eric, write a lot about Iran. They tweet a lot about Iran. I would encourage you to read what they write, which probably answers a lot of the questions you might have on your mind. Thank you very much to the JCPOA for putting this and other conference calls together. It's a tremendous service, I think, to really try to educate so many people about important national security issues that we face. And thank you all for joining us. I hope that you'll continue to join these conference calls. I hope to encounter you again in one of them. And I wish you a wonderful weekend. Thanks very much, everyone.